We're going to talk about the 18th century. The 18th century was a time that was rather happy, and the population was quite happy with it because a lot of war had ended during the 17th century, which meant that people could focus on the culture instead of worrying about issues abroad. And it was wealthier also because the Industrial Revolution had started, and people definitely noticed that at the end of the 18th century. So people were richer and the middle class was growing. And the censorship had ended in
1695, yeah.
Yeah.
The Licensing Act of Censorship of the Press.
Which meant that people were able to write a lot more about criticizing, and it was also during the Augustan period, Augustan literature period, which was when you took a lot of inspiration from the ancient Greek and the ancient Romans. So the authors took a lot of inspiration from them and used their techniques when they were writing. So
and combined it with satire, because satire was very popular.
Yeah.
So they combined it into mock heroic or mock epic, which is a kind of satire that uses a lot of hyperbolics. They tend to take like a trivial thing and describe it as they did in the old Greek.
Yeah, they turn it into an epic.
Yeah, and that kind of underlines how trivial it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then, since satire was so big again in the 18th century, as a consequence of the licensing having ended, there were three big kinds of satire.
A Horatian satire's goal is to heal the situation with smiles rather than anger. Horatian satire is a gentle reminder to take life less seriously, and it makes fun of general human folly rather than engaging in specific or personal attacks.
Okay. Should I? Okay.
I'll take a minute again.
Okay. Juvenile satires, they want to, somehow provoke some kind of a change. If there's something they think is wrong with society, and they kind of like mock the structures in society, by exaggerating their words.
Menippean satire, in which contemporary institutions, conventions, and ideas were criticized in a mocking satiric style that mingled prose and verse.
So it was a non-fictional way of making satire. If we compare, for example, we have A Modest Proposal, which takes place in our world. He's giving a very real proposal that some people actually thought was real. So that's a juvenile satire because it attacks very aggressively. But Menippean satire, that is when you take satire and you write it in a way so people they recognize it, but it's not set in the same world as ours. It's more fiction than non-fiction.
Isn't Menippean also that they don't attack specific people? It's more of or I'm not sure if that's right.
They can attack specific institutions, but it's not really a specific person. It's more the society in general, as in comparison to the juvenile, which at many times can attack a specific person. And we made a timeline to have a better overlook of our works and to be able to see where the Enlightenment had the most influence and when the Romanticism was beginning to gain influence.
Yeah, and our timeline begins in 1714 with The Rape of the Lock. It was written by Alexander Pope. It was a poem about a girl who's a young lord had snipped off a lock of hair from a girl, and she had made a very big deal out of it, and this had emerged into a fight between families, and Alexander Pope was hired to make a Horatian satire out of it, to show them how show the girl and the boy how silly it is to fight over this. And he did a very good job because the families became friends again.
The next piece of literature in the list is a poem called Trivia, or The Art of Walking the Streets of London, written 2 years later in 1716 by John Gay. So the poem is about, it's basically a bunch of advice given to a muse that is walking through the streets of London. And in the poem, different types of people or with different jobs are described, and their reliability and how they act, and whether this muse should watch out or trust them is explained, and it's all based on their jobs, the people's jobs, which was typical during the Enlightenment.
Then in 1719, the novel Robinson Crusoe came out, written by
Daniel Defoe.
Yeah, and it is a novel about a man who's stranded on a deserted island, and the entire book is about how he solves the practical things and how he survives. And it embodies the Enlightenment because it is like all about the practical things, and it celebrates how smart he is to solve the situations.
The next one is Gulliver's Travels, published in 1726 and written by Jonathan Swift, and it's a Menippean satire. The book is about Gulliver, who goes on 4 different journeys and kind of receives a new perspective on life by the end of it. And there's a lot that happens, but to keep it short, one of the important journeys is the first journey, where he goes to this place called Lilliput, where he's surrounded by small human beings, and he's a giant among them. And Jonathan Swift kind of uses these characters to criticize different political or cultural or religious issues. So, for example, he kind of mocks the political.
Mocks the political
situation in Britain during that time by, for example, comparing them to the Lilliputians, who kind of chose their ministers based on who was best at walking on tight ropes, which had nothing to do with politics. And he did the same way by criticizing the religious and also the cultural situations that existed then. By, for example, comparing the humans to like horses, some horse characters, and the different things that the characters did. I can't go into more detail, it takes a long time.
Okay, and the next piece of literature on the list is Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, from 1740, written by Samuel Richardson. And it's quite different from all these others because it's more of a novel written for the public, and it's not satire, it's quite romantical because it's about a servant girl who is where there is a lord who's trying to seduce her, and the whole book is about how she's running away from him and he's trying to make her his mistress, but she refuses him. And the book it reminded me of like Twilight or 50 Shades of Grey because it's not a very good book, it's not very well written, but it keeps people reading because of the plot and because they're interested in her fate and in her emotions, and they're pulled in by her and they feel sorry for her. And as as the current situation is with 50 Shades of Grey and Twilight, of course there are people who are parodizing it. So in 1741, a book called Shamala was released, and it's a satire and it's a parody of Pamela, where he's making fun of this, and we can here notice the split between the romantical and the Enlightenment, because the person who wrote Pamela was quite romantic, but the person who wrote Shyamalan, he thought that entire thing was stupid and people should focus on what's important and on logic and on thinking and not in just enjoying this girl's story. So he wrote a juvenile satire of the work Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, where Pamela, instead of being a virtuous virgin, is a prostitute who's trying to seduce this squire called Squire Booby. Him. So that's pretty much all you have to say.
That. Okay, so I read The Sorrows of Young Werther, written by Goethe in 1774. This novel really defined romanticism because it was based on a lot of emotion. So basically the protagonist falls in love with a girl, she doesn't love him, so he kills himself, which is really something that expresses feelings and that how much they mattered in this novel.
Yeah.
Let's continue.
Okay. And we can compare Robinson Crusoe, which was written just 55 years before. Robinson Crusoe, which embodies the Enlightenment, was written just 55 years before, about 55 years before The Sorrows of Young Werther, which defined Romanticism. So the 17th century. In the 17th century, there's both the Enlightenment and the Romanticism, which are clashing with each other.
Which I guess is why it's hard to define the exact.
It's hard delineating the period.
Delineating the period, because there's an overlap of both.
Yeah,
and that's what's outlining for the period. And there were a lot of epistolary novels, which is a novel written in a series of documents, like The Sorrows of Young Werther, or Pamela, Virtue Rewarded, or Shyamalan, or Robinson Crusoe. And that is because you want to make the book more realistic, and you want the person who's reading it to be able to see himself in the person's situation. You want to be able to see it as a realistic event. And so that seems quite important for the 18th century people too, that a lot of it has to be grounded in reality.
Yes.
Because everything, like both the satire and the fictional, is to make people think. So it's a lot of thinking going on.
Yeah.
Our time period, it didn't have a specific name. We just had like the 18th century.
Exactly.
And that is because we have two big
and also there was also satires, but
Yeah.
But that is kind of combinable.
Yeah.
Okay, I have to cut a lot.
Okay.
Yeah.
In this.
But I think we're
But
done.
okay, but the 18th century is the time at the rise of the satire. It's the period between the Enlightenment and Romanticism, and this is what defines the 18th century, being a time of transition.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. The progress from Enlightenment to
Romanticism.